Good evening and welcome to KochBusting, Ending the Spell, an evening to expose and oppose the influence of the Koch brothers. My name is Linda Rousseau. I'm one of the co-chairs, along with Lorene Grubert of the Peace and Justice Task Force here at All Souls Unitarian Church. And I'm also a member of the Big Apple Coffee Party, the two old volunteer organizations that have produced tonight's program with the support of our co-sponsor, The Nation magazine. The Big Apple Coffee Party is a local affiliate of Coffee Party USA. We are in our third year and came together around the basic principles of nonpartisanship and civility. Our main focus is getting money out of politics, and hence our connection to the notorious Koch brothers. The All Souls Peace and Justice Task Force is dedicated to helping members of All Souls Church and the larger community envision and create a more equitable and peace-oriented world. Our activities are based on the energy and the imagination of members and friends. A few ground rules for tonight. We will begin with a presentation by our distinguished panelists on the damage of our democracy brought about by the Koch brothers, followed by a panel discussion. After the discussion, there will be ample time for questions from the audience. There are information tables in the back, and while you're visiting them, please consider making a donation towards the cost of this exciting forum. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our extraordinary moderator for this evening, who will then introduce our illustrious panel. She is Laura Flanders. Ms. Flanders is the executive producer and host of the Laura Flanders Show, and the founder of GritTV.org. She is currently a contributing writer to The Nation magazine and a regular contributor to MSNBC. Laura is also a best-selling author. Please welcome Laura Flanders.
Thank you. All right, ending the spell. How many of you feel you are under the spell of the Koch brothers? Oh, come on now. Chemicals, minerals, plastics, politicians, the press. Can any of you truly say you are Koch-free? But maybe I should just get one thing clear. Is there anyone here who thinks they're here for a panel about our late departed recent mayor? Okay, just checking. All of you are pretty clear that the Koch brothers are the other one of the many octopuses in our political scene. Their tentacles extend into almost every part of our political and commercial lives. We're going to find out some more sort of horrifying details here. But we're also going to talk about what groups like yours can do to make a difference, to try to reinvigorate our economy, take our democracy, take it back from some of these folks. So how many of you are actually engaged and excited to not just oppose, or not just expose that we're going to do tonight, but do the opposing that we are promising? We're promising opposing the Koch brothers. I don't see everybody's hands up. All right. Okay, very good. So I think you're in the right room, and I think we've got the right panelists, and we're going to talk about the Koch brothers, not just their influence on recent elections. By the way, how many of you think they were served a tremendous defeat last November? Okay. How many of you think they just scuttled away to lick their wounds? Yeah, exactly. So this is more or less where we're at. We're going to be talking not just about their influence on individual campaigns and elections, but more broadly on our democracy itself. Also on our legislation as it comes to us at the state level, at the local level, and nationally, of course. We're going to be talking a little bit about the role of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. That is, we've got really the person who knows more about ALEC than anyone else in the world, which is Lisa Graves. And by the end of this, we're going to give you a chance to ask some questions. So prepare your questions. I'm going to demand that they have a question mark at the end. all right? Otherwise, John will make that nasty noise with the cable that he's perfecting and he's not going to do anymore. John? Okay. A moderator's work is really tough. Without further ado, as the woman said, let me introduce our guests are Lee Fang. He's a contributing writer for The Nation magazine and a fellow with the Nation Institute. Lee. Lisa Graves is the executive director of the Center for Media and Democracy. Lisa, yay. And John Nichols is Washington political correspondent for The Nation magazine and also an associate editor of the Capital Times in Madison. We're going to start with you, Lee. It is the big octopus with tentacles, the Koch brothers, or maybe I should say they are the big octopus with tentacles. And I think a lot of us have some sense that they have a tentacle in every pie. But we're going to come to you to ask the basic questions. Who are the Koch brothers? Where do they get their money from? How did they come to be? And what's their influence?
Well, thanks, Laura, and thank you to the Coffee Party for having me here. It's nice to be here with my esteemed co-panelists. I think to describe the Koch brothers and why they're kind of unique among donors to the conservative movement or to any political movement, because obviously there are wealthy people who donate to causes they believe in. You have to go back and start the story with their father, Fred Koch. Fred Koch started an oil company. He invented a certain process that led to him buying several refineries. He accumulated some of his wealth in the Soviet Union, helping build refineries there. Out of that experience, he said that he saw the horrors of communism while making a fortune building these refineries. He came back to the United States, expanded his business, and later founded or helped co-found the John Birch Society. He was very invested in those beliefs. He wrote a very long pamphlet, almost like a mini book, describing his beliefs, saying why he thought that the Eisenhower administration was in bed with the communists, that the civil rights movement was a conspiracy, a Soviet conspiracy to rile up African Americans to take over American cities. He had very strong political beliefs. He helped underwrite Barry Goldwater's first book, or his kind of coming out book, and distributed those around the country, helping to kind of boost Barry Goldwater to the center of the GOP and really focusing his efforts to move the country right by focusing on the Republican Party, moving the Republican Party to the right. He passed away in the 60s, and his son, Charles Koch, and his three brothers inherited the company and renamed it Koch Industries in honor of their father. Now, we can't ascribe all of the beliefs of the father to the sons, but we can say that Charles Koch deeply honored his father and started founding political groups, in some sense, reminiscent of the John Birch Society. Starting in the 1980s, this is where the term Kochtopus came from. It's actually from libertarians. Murray Rothbard said that these wealthy Koch brothers are coming in and just buying up our movement, kind of pushing out traditional libertarians who believe in drug decriminalization, social liberties, and pushing this really hard economic line, and censoring their opponents. So a professor, Richard Fink, started working closely with the Koch brothers with this kind of new strategy. They said it was inspired by Friedrich Hayek. They took Friedrich Hayek's industrial process and wanted to apply that process to ideas. So instead of when you break down a product, you have to see the raw material, gathering that raw material, manufacturing it, distributing it, and marketing it. Well, they said, why don't we take this approach to the realm of policy ideas? Let's found and start political organizations that churn out very far-right ideas. Let's manufacture those. Let's create organizations that turn them into laws. Let's fund an array of groups that hire young conservatives to push these ideas. Let's elect politicians, let's buy ads, let's start organizations that push these ideas into the grassroots. There's nothing, I mean, really this is a brilliant tactical turn, because out of this kind of concept came at least 60 different nonprofit groups, all devoted to marketing these type of rather radical economic ideas. The most famous, of course, is Americans for Prosperity, the grassroots group that was pivotal in organizing the Tea Parties. But one of the other things that makes the Koch brothers a little bit different than other, I mean, of course, ExxonMobil, many other companies fund conservative groups and some liberal groups as well to try to pursue their own selfish economic interests. But the Koch brothers are kind of unique here because so much of their activism and their philanthropy relates, back to their bottom line. Their philanthropy to all of these different think tanks and advocacy groups is coordinated from their lobbying office in DC. Richard Fink, who's still around, works at Koch Public Sector, their lobbying office. Koch Industries is very concerned about environmental regulations. They had over 300 oil spills in 6 states throughout the 90s. And of course, they're one of the largest emitters of carbon dioxide in the country. Hundreds of millions of tons emitted every year by some estimates. So if you look at the kind of totality of Koch Industries, it's a company that has oil, coal, pipeline, shipping, they manufacture fertilizer, household goods, wood and pulp and paper products, and they also have a financial arm that engages in some commodity speculation. If you look at this kind of totality, and then look at the types of advocacy that the groups they fund, it all relates back to, in different ways, benefiting different Koch companies. And I think that's the problem here, because a lot of this advocacy is at the expense of the public interest, while it's maybe veiled in a way that it's kind of cloaked as ideology. This is promoting free markets, liberty or freedom. If you boil down and look carefully at what these Koch groups are doing, they're trying to tear down the Clean Air Act. They're trying to deny global warming. Why? Because Koch Industries would clearly benefit from some of these policies. I could go on for a while, but I want to kind of cue it off to my other panelists.
Perfect. Lisa, come on in here.
Sure. Well, I have to say that I've been looking at some of the things that Kochs have been up to for quite some time, but I had a chance to look at them more closely in my new job after I left Washington to go lead the Center for Media and Democracy, which is located in Madison, Wisconsin. And in that work, I ended up in a situation in which a whistleblower contacted me in the spring of 2011. This was in the immediate aftermath of the uprising in Wisconsin, where, as you saw in the news, tens of thousands and ultimately, well over 100,000 people came out to the Wisconsin Capitol in protest, in solidarity against these extreme policies pushed for by the Governor Scott Walker. In the midst of that debate and that public outcry, including what you probably have never seen in New York City, which was a tractorcade of tractors that had come in from the countryside in a parade around the Capitol in opposition to these policies. In the midst of that, there was a lot of talk about whether the agenda that was being pushed in Wisconsin was a Koch agenda, whether the agenda being pushed in Wisconsin was an ALEC agenda, and ALEC stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council. In the midst of that, those conversations, people started taking a closer look. So we looked at who were Scott Walker's big donors. The biggest donor, tied for the largest donor to Scott Walker under the then existing campaign finance limitations in Wisconsin, was Koch, was Koch related. Then it turned out that David Koch had written a check to the Republican Governors Association to help fund the election of Scott Walker and other governors in the Midwest. And so it turned out that the Kochs were very interested in what was happening in Wisconsin. I I think of that effort, the focus on Wisconsin, as sort of a decapitation strategy, an effort to turn that state red, to gut labor in a state in which labor has been strong historically, really a forerunner of that. And I know John can speak to that more at length, but in essence, there was a targeting of Wisconsin and other states as a way to turn the nation red or redder. And obviously, Wisconsin has been central in this most recent round of electoral politics, including Reince Priebus, the head of the RNC, is from Wisconsin, and Paul Ryan, the vice presidential candidate, is from Wisconsin. So Wisconsin figures central, and not just because John and I are from there. What happened that spring, just to give you that little background, was that a professor from the University of Wisconsin actually wrote an article wondering whether ALEC was involved, this American Legislative Exchange Council, and as a result of that raising of the question, a whistleblower came forward and provided me all of the bills that had been secretly voted on through the American Legislative Exchange Council. And you may be thinking, what is this ALEC? Perhaps you've heard of them. What does it mean to be voted on bills? Because I'm someone who worked in Washington for a number of years. I was formerly the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Policy at the Justice Department. I was formerly the Chief Counsel for Nominations for the Senate Judiciary Committee. I was formerly the Chief and the Senior Legislative Strategist for the ACLU, the chief person on the Patriot Act reauthorization fight in 2005. So I've been around Washington. I'm not naive. I know how sausages are made. I've seen it made. But in all of my time in Washington, I had never seen what I saw in ALEC. ALEC is not merely a lobbying organization that says it does no lobbying. ALEC is an organization through which corporate lobbyists actually sit around a table bigger than this and vote as equals with our elected state representatives from every state in the country almost. And they vote as equals on model bills to change our rights. Those model bills, these templates to change our rights, are then introduced in the state houses across the country, cleansed of any reference to the fact that they were previously voted on by lobbyists, including lobbyists from Koch Industries, including lobbyists from some of the biggest tobacco companies in the world, Reynolds Tobacco, some of the biggest oil companies in the world, Shell, Exxon, BP, some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, and the biggest telecom companies in the world, AT&T, Verizon, and others. And some of the biggest closely held companies in the world, Koch Industries, Peabody Coal. So what you have through ALEC is a circumstance in which an organization was created almost 40 years ago. It was created in response to the claims by the lawyer for the United States Chamber of Commerce, who suggested, in essence, that the Nixon administration was too hostile to corporations. The corporations' voices were not being heard by the Nixon administration, because the Nixon administration, turned out to actually somehow approve the Clean Water Act. Imagine that, clean water. How dare we have clean water? That's just a bridge too far, apparently. How dare we have an Environmental Protection Agency? How dare we have an EPA? How dare we have these efforts to protect our environment and to protect our government in the aftermath of Watergate? And so you had ALEC emerge on the scene in the early 1970s, 73, 74, and it emerged as a way to give businesses a voice, a greater voice in our state houses. And it operated below the radar screen for many, many years. In the late 1990s, there might be a report that came out, some group would write, and then it would get no coverage in the press. So what happened in 2011 is that after the whistleblower contacted me, I actually had dinner with John, and we talked about what had happened with these bills. And what was apparent was that there were almost 1,000 pieces of legislation that had been pre-approved by corporations and secretly voted on by them. And ALEC's materials in those documents that were provided, ALEC's propaganda to its members, said that the unique element of ALEC was that corporations would get an equal, quote, voice and vote, an equal voice and vote. The legislatures, that's their pitch to corporations, including the Koch brothers. So how do the Koch brothers figure into this? When we launched ALEC Exposed at the Center for Media and Democracy, we worked with The Nation magazine to break that story, and John wrote the cover piece for that and wrote a piece on democracy about how ALEC was involved in making it harder for Americans to vote. But the website that we launched, alecexposed.org, and there are postcards in the back, so if you want to go check it out, it's there, documented what the effect of this agenda was on workers' rights, on our environment, on the health of our families, on our senior citizens, on Americans who are killed or injured by corporate products, on our tax policy, on health, on our health care and Social Security and safety net programs. On all of these fronts, ALEC was extremely active. So what we knew from my research and our research was that the Koch brothers became involved in ALEC about 20 years ago. They may have been involved sooner, but the earliest we can document is in the early 1990s. And there's a bit of a story there, which I can tell briefly, which is from my perspective, having examined the Kochs in great detail, what you see is, now some of you might have rebelled against your parents. You might have taken a different path, but as Lee pointed out, I think that what David and Charles Koch have done in essence is the apple that doesn't fall far from the tree situation, and they have, in essence, spent the last 40 years basically trying to popularize extreme and radical ideas, trying to normalize them. And that work actually began in the 1970s when Charles Koch started to help create what was known as the Cato Institute, or became the Cato Institute. And one of the first efforts that they pushed was, in the 1970s, the privatization of Social Security. So this is not a new idea. This is just newly wide. This idea of privatizing security was at the fringes of society in the late 1970s. But who was there at the fringe pushing this idea, trying to move it into the middle, into the mainstream, into the dialogue? It was Charles Koch. Then David Koch ran for vice president in 1980 to the right of Ronald Reagan. And when he ran for that post and lost, roundly as a third-party candidate, in essence, they sort of redoubled their efforts, thought about how they were going to do this, and ultimately David Koch created an organization called Citizens for a Sound Economy. Now, I think they've gotten their rhetoric better. They've decided Citizens for a Sound Economy isn't nearly as sexy as Americans for Prosperity, which I call Americans for Greed. But they started Citizens for a Sound Economy, and in that process, they were peddling a whole host of bad ideas. One of the things they did that many people don't know is that in the aftermath of the stock shock that many of you might remember in the late 1980s and 1987, after the kind of Dark Monday or something that we had back then, who came out with the effort to kill Glass-Steagall? David Koch's Citizens for a Sound Economy. Then they spent the next several years pushing for the evisceration of Glass-Steagall until finally, in a combination of having Clinton, DLC Democrat in the White House, and having Republican pressure, they were able to get Glass-Steagall repealed, and then fast forward to the most recent crisis in which Glass-Steagall and the separation of banking and the gambling investment sector would have been profound. And so the Kochs have been involved with ALEC since at least the day that they received ALEC's Adam Smith Award in 1993. And so they have been central in ALEC, and through ALEC, they don't just have one vote on the board of ALEC. They have multiple votes on multiple committees, unlike anyone in this audience, except for maybe if there's a right-wing group that's represented here.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, a lot to follow up with on both of them. Thank you so much. John.
Hello. All right, I am just bedazzled by my fellow panelists and all these wonderful people, and just imagine what has occurred for democracy. That when we've peeled the veneer away from some of the most powerful, wealthy people in the country and begun to tell their story, we get hundreds of people out in a church in New York City to learn more about it and learn how to deal with it. Everybody often says, I hear it so often, oh, things are getting worse, things are really bad. You folks are an example of exactly why we will ultimately win all of our battles. Because when people find out about a problem and they come out and join to learn more about it and do something, that's where we shift the process. So I'm excited to be with you. I am a little troubled by my friend Lee. He was very easy on Fred Koch. Fred Koch co-founded the John Birch Society. And he said, and I quote, "The black man looms large in the communist plan to take over America." I'm not kidding. But you see, that was only in the late 1950s, so after. And he also had so many crazy theories that he could explain away just about every bit of progress since the medieval era. And this is an important thing to understand. There are a lot of people who think the Koch brothers are conservatives. They're not. They're nutty conspiracy theorists. And they've got crackpot theories that allow them to justify doing things that aren't just right-wing or conservative. I have many conservative friends who propose things I don't like. No, these guys have such kooky theories, they are willing to propose and advance ideas that will do severe damage. It's not winning or losing a political debate. It's severe damage because they believe things that are so far out. Now, and that is fine, because I have lots of friends who believe things that are really far out. The problem is that when you give a couple of guys who have incredibly far out, wacky ideas tens of billions of dollars, and they can literally buy the political process with interest on their money, not with the principal, that's where you get a problem. And as Lisa referenced, David Koch thought, as anybody who's kind of out there thinks, I could be the vice president. And so he attached himself to the Libertarian Party ticket in 1980 in the old-fashioned way. He bought his way on. It wasn't like the Libertarians were sitting around saying, oh, we want David Koch to be our nominee for vice president. No, he said, I'll give you $100,000 a month for the whole course of this almost 2-year campaign if you let me be the vice presidential nominee. So they let him be it. And he pumped money in. The Libertarians, one time in their history, have had national television ads. It was in 1980. And the interesting thing is, they lost. I'm hearing voices. They lost badly. And David Koch did learn a lesson from that campaign. So did his brother Charles. The lesson was, and they've said it explicitly, that politicians are just actors on the stage. David Koch said, I'll never run for office again. I figured this thing out. You don't want to be the actor. You want to write the script. And you want to be the playwright. And so that is the point at which these two guys decided to become the playwrights of American politics. And to fast forward into it, understand that they're structuralists, and that's a big deal. They are not all that interested in a specific issue. Now, they may want, a little change to allow them to buy a power plant or to, not be taxed and stuff like that. But what they really want is to establish a system where they always win. And that's where the ALEC project becomes such an interesting one. And they have become increasingly devoted to ALEC over time. I think we do an overemphasis on Americans for Prosperity and an overemphasis on their role in Cato and some of these other ones. These are both activist groupings and think tanks. It's in ALEC that they actually change the laws of the country. And the interesting thing is, where do they put their deepest interest within ALEC? Where? Oh, I've got it. There's an ALEC commission that deals with elections and voting. And the interesting thing is that when we started looking at ALEC, who each of these different commissions within ALEC that deal with, litigation or deal with labor regulation, they each have a paid staffer. Some member, corporate or otherwise, of ALEC puts a paid staffer in, or somebody who comes from them. Well, guess who where the staffer for the elections grouping within ALEC was from? The Koch brothers. And here's the interesting thing that they propose. First off, you're going to be shocked by this, voter ID laws. Really strict voter ID laws, which, by the way, they tie to immigration reform and their claim that we need tough voter ID laws because people who come from some of the most impoverished circumstances in America and risk their lives to come to this country to get work to support their families are going to be so desperate to vote that they will do so illegally. And so there's an incredible fantasy that they've developed about voter fraud, about illegal immigrants voting, and they push this with a passion like you wouldn't believe. There's a reason why these laws keep coming up. It's because they promote them. There's a whole bunch of other things that this commission does as well. They have proposals to, for instance, make it much harder to put a referendum on the ballot. You think, well, why would the Koch brothers care about putting referendums on the ballot? They got very, very concerned a few years ago because they found out that referendums that proposed to raise the minimum wage seemed to be winning in a lot of places. And so they tried to raise the limits. They've raised the limits for all sorts of access to democracy. The other thing that they do, which is a big, big thing, do you know how many, when you look around, seriously, how many people in this room are really desperate to keep the Electoral College? Pop your hands up. I bet if you went almost anywhere in America and you said, how big a priority is it for you to keep the Electoral College? Established at the founding of the Republic to make sure, among other, the same people that were saying that African Americans are 3/5 of human beings were saying we needed an Electoral College to make sure that the people don't actually choose the president. We are now the largest country in the world that's got a system where the winner of our election, the popular vote winner, doesn't necessarily become the president of the United States. And you're like, well, that could never happen. George Bush lost by the standards of any other country that we relate to. He lost the presidency in 2000 by 560,000 votes, and yet he became president of the United States. If we were a functional republic, we would have had an outcry saying, no, we voted for the other guy. Why is there such pressure to keep the Electoral College? Alec and the Koch brothers have a whole campaign in the legislatures around the country to keep the Electoral College. They also have a whole campaign to undermine anybody that questions the Electoral College. Like if you put a proposal in saying, well, maybe we could look at some sort of different voting. No, that's got to be condemned. They also favored, when the Citizens United ruling came down, they had model legislation or model resolutions for legislatures around the country saying, what a great idea that was. I bet you didn't know there was somebody actually advocating for that, but there is. They advocate for more money in politics. And all of this, okay, Leah suggested they might be slightly self-serving. Something else. Self-serving is one thing, but when you spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the other guys don't have a chance, that's where it gets scary. So parallel to their electoral activism, to this effort to make sure that our democracy has barrier after barrier at the polls through voter ID, if all else fails, that the people actually elect somebody through the Electoral College, all these different, protect all the barriers, make it harder to do a referendum. At the same time they do that, there's meticulous campaigning through ALEC and other organizations to undermine the organized groups that might challenge them. And so, what are major targets of ALEC? Oh, I don't know. Trial lawyers? Because in the southern United States, because we have the evil right to work laws in this country, in the southern United States, unions pretty weak, trial lawyers are essentially the backbone of social justice, economic justice, donating to campaigns. So massive efforts to do so-called tort reform, tort deform, that undermines the trial lawyers. This is all over the United States, and a major effort. When Scott Walker came in as governor of Wisconsin, in the first month, before they went after the unions, they went after the trial lawyers. And then in the second month, they went after the unions because, again, this is a major component of what they're doing. And why is there such a focus on public sector unions? Because public sector unions defend the commons. They tend to be the unions that give a lot of money, especially to defend public education, public services, not a social democracy, but a civil society. And so the Koch brothers have used their money for a very, very long time to establish a political system where they win and you lose. They have used their money, they have used their structural influence, and people will say they lost in 2012 because Mitt Romney didn't become president. Remember, these are people that thought Ronald Reagan was too liberal. They aren't losing. The Koch brothers give money all over the country at every level of our politics. And I will remind you that many of these wealthy donors who gave to Romney also gave in the state of Michigan, gave a lot of money in the state of Michigan to to block collective bargaining in that state. They beat collective bargaining with their massive spending, and a month later, the state of Michigan put in right-to-work laws. The heartland of labor passed right to work. Today, the governor of Michigan took over the city of Detroit and replaced the elected leaders of that city with an appointed, quote-unquote, emergency manager. The end of democracy in Detroit, at least for this time. They aren't losing, they're winning. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, lucky me, I get to ask some questions, but then you do. And don't forget that question mark. We'll just go for a little while. I heard some news recently that, Lee, I wanted to get you to respond to. Is it just a rumor that the Koch brothers are interested in buying up newspapers, the Tribune newspaper company that owns the LA Times?
It came out 2 days ago that there's speculation that the Koch brothers were making a bid for the Tribune company, at least their newspapers. They own the Los Angeles Times, Baltimore Sun, Chicago Tribune, some other papers. But Reuters reported yesterday that it's looking pretty serious, that they are putting in a bid. They're hoping to buy those newspapers. And you know, there's something kind of interesting there. The Koch spokeswoman, she said that they're interested, but they believe in journalistic independence, and they're always looking to buy profitable companies. So it's a little. I think it is a little bit disconcerting for any extremely partisan billionaire to buy a newspaper, but particularly the Koch brothers, and that's because if you look at the Koch brothers' philanthropy, if you want to call that, throughout the political spectrum, they're very involved in their investments. They give to, I believe, about 100 universities to create academic chairs and study programs that promote their beliefs. And there was a fairly recent story about a year and a half ago that showed that when they were giving a donation to Florida State University, they actually made part of that earmarked funds. They get to review the type of research that's done. They get to review who's actually hired at that department. Last year, the Cato Institute, which, as Lisa mentioned, founded by the Koch brothers, was originally called the Charles Koch Institute. There are other donors involved in the Cato Institute, and the Koch brothers were looking to take over the entire organization. There was a lawsuit, and at one point, the Koch brothers even started trying to appoint neoconservatives and Koch lobbyists to the board to try to take over the organization. One of the bloggers that they tried to appoint at Cato, and mind you, this is supposedly a libertarian organization, John Hinderaker, this Koch-nominated board member, supports torture, opposes gay marriage, opposes drug decriminalization, supports the war in Iraq. So, if you look at the totality of Koch's political investments and their kind of obsession with auditing and taking a careful look at what every single one of these groups are doing and what they're achieving, I think it should be at least pretty troubling that they're looking to buy these papers.
Lisa, you talked about the role of ALEC and the relationship between the Koch brothers and ALEC, and I would love you to lay out for people a little bit of how you discover this stuff, because I think for some of us, the first time we heard about ALEC was the Trayvon Martin case, where we realized, wow, something to do with guns and a shooting has to do with this shadowy background organization. It might be helpful, right, as a researcher to talk a little bit about how the dots connect. And then I have another question for the two of you.
Well, so when I looked at the bills that had been voted on by these corporations,
take one example, one that we might.
Well, let's take the gun example. So, when the news started breaking about what was happening in Florida last year this time, that this young man, this high school student, had been shot dead by this person in the neighborhood, and that the young man had been unarmed, and that the person who killed him was not going to be arrested or charged with a crime. And the reason that was initially cited in the press was what they called the Stand Your Ground law. We knew immediately that that was an ALEC ratified bill. And so my staff counsel started writing an article. I started doing the research. We dropped everything, and basically we connected the dots between ALEC and that law. And what we did was, because the bills were available, because we had analyzed them and made them widely available on the internet, you could finally trace a bill back to ALEC. You could finally trace it. Before, all sorts of laws across the country have been adopted and passed, and you had no idea that these were ALEC bills, for the most part, unless ALEC issued a press release saying, this is a great idea. Imagine, they never said, this is a great idea necessarily, this is our idea. In certain instances, they wouldn't take credit, they would praise. In this instance, because we had the bill, we could take that bill and line it up side by side with the law in Florida and say, oh, it's virtually the same. And so what happened in Florida, what we documented that helped break that story nationally, was that the NRA's chief lobbyist in Florida, Marion Hammer, had basically gone to 2 ALEC legislators and said, in the aftermath of the 2004 election, when Bush won the presidency, that time, the NRA was looking for sort of a new angle politically, basically, about how to concoct a threat to gun rights that did not exist, because no anti-gun legislation was passing through Congress. The assault weapons ban was not renewed. There wasn't some, a real boogeyman that they could point to, so they created this idea, and at the time they called it the castle doctrine. We got to pass this castle doctrine so you can defend your castle. And yet, in U.S. law, you've had a long-standing right for 200 years to defend your castle. What that law did was basically make your castle a roving castle. Wherever you walked around the city was your castle, and you could shoot someone dead if you believed that your life was in danger. You didn't have a duty to retreat. So what Marion Hammer did was get that bill introduced in the State House in Florida. It went through the Leg Council there, and then it was signed into law by Jeb Bush in the spring of 2005, and then Marion Hammer traveled to a convention in Texas for ALEC where George W. Bush keynoted, and at a closed-door meeting behind closed doors, Marion Hammer, the NRA lobbyist, went to this committee where the NRA has an equal vote to politicians and presented this bill as an ideal bill. That meeting was co-chaired by Walmart. Walmart, the largest retailer of ammunition on the planet, the largest seller of long guns in the United States, and it was unanimously approved at that meeting. And we pulled the documents to prove it through research and through just digging. And then we helped tell that story in the news so that people could understand that this cookie-cutter legislation was ratified by ALEC. It then passed in over 24 states and was introduced in more than that. And then it was part of a larger gun agenda of the ALEC and the NRA working in tandem, and part of a similar thing that we were seeing with these voter ID bills passing in cookie-cutter form across the country. And you could see the patterns, and the patterns were based in part on ALEC getting these bills in the hands of legislators and getting them into law.
And in light of what Lee said about self-interest, to what extent do the Koch brothers care about the gun laws, or are they just in bed with their Walmart friends, and that's why they're supporting ALEC?
Well, now, the Koch brothers have said that they personally, or their organization, in essence, has opposed people being able to carry guns into the workplace, into Koch workplaces. So when we came out with the story about the Stand Your Ground law, they basically issued a press release defending this and saying that they had nothing to do with gun laws. Well, it turned out that that was not entirely true, because as we documented in some pieces that we posted on our other site, PR Watch, it turned out that the Koch brothers had been involved in ALEC since the early 1990s. They had had a seat on the board of ALEC, the corporate board, for well over a decade. Their Koch Industries representative chaired ALEC's corporate board for a period, and through this entire time in which ALEC has been pushing bad gun idea after bad gun idea after bad gun idea, Koch Industries has been funding ALEC through their board member and through their representation on these various ALEC task forces. Koch Family Foundations, their so-called charitable arm, has been funding ALEC, and they have not objected. In fact, we saw that in 2011, Koch Industries was on the gun task force, on the task force known as Public Safety and Elections, and that bills and ideas were pushed there on gun policy, and there was no apparent objection. And in fact, what you see, while the Koch brothers want to disavow, in essence, this attachment to this particular set of laws and this impact with Trayvon Martin, the fact is that they have funded and fueled this organization for well over, in essence, at least 2 decades. They've been a leader of it. They have been on key committees, and in fact, what we're seeing now is that ALEC has moved this past year to hire the Edelman PR firm. The Edelman PR firm has an express plan to do basically opposition research on anyone who dares to object to the ALEC agenda and to try to smear them. And then what we see amazingly, perhaps it's a coincidence, that in right-wing publications like Free Beacon and others that are funded by unknown donors, you see these smears appearing in print attacking the people who dare to speak out against ALEC.
Which one of you, and I'm hoping one of you might have looked into this, could tell us a little bit about whether the Koch brothers or the industries are interested in our hydrofracking debate here in New York? Because it seems to be a ripe territory for them, right? Does everybody know about the debate around so-called natural gas fracking in upstate? This seems right up their alley. So what role are they playing? Lee?
Koch Industries manufactures chemicals used in the fracking process. They have
Did
a
everybody
plant.
hear that?
Oh, am I close enough to the mic? Thank you. Koch Industries manufactures chemicals used in the fracking process. They have a facility in southern Texas, I believe it's the Eagle Ford Shale, that they're currently helping to frack. I believe they also do some of the logistics and transportation work associated with fracking. So they have a certain business interest, and I think it's likely that they're also involved in fracking in other parts of the country. But if you look again at this kind of large network of policy organizations, in Pennsylvania, Americans for Prosperity has been demanding deregulation of fracking, pushing these laws that make it difficult for the public to know what's being pumped underground and possibly into drinking water. And again, they have just so many think tanks that kind of work together with the politicians that are funded by Koch and many other pro-fracking companies, and the policy organizations. Again, in Pennsylvania, there's a group called the Commonwealth Foundation for Public Policy. It's another one of these mini think tanks, and they're constantly producing the raw materials, I suppose, the policy papers that support deregulated fracking, opposition to taxes on this very profitable industry. So yes, they do have some connections to fracking.
All right, before we get totally depressed, John, Lisa mentioned, bizarrely enough, that Nixon passed the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. One of the reasons he did that was because there were massive demonstrations, Green Day, Earth Day, the first environmental and ecological movements. There was a lot of noise in the street. What evidence, or is there any evidence, that this agenda of the Koch brothers is susceptible to public pressure?
That's a very good question. And, I kind of think the 2012 election is reasonably good influence. They made their biggest play ever. And there is some evidence. One of the things with the Koch brothers is that when you come to an event like this, you start hearing the three of us talking and Laura, pretty soon you start to think they're running everything. Right? I mean, that they must be the master manipulators, like the wizard in The Wizard of Oz. And in fact, they're not. This is an important thing to understand. They are a part of a network of really rich people who come together to run everything. And they actually have these conferences, right, where they invite a lot of rich people to come out. And, if you're a billionaire, you are more than welcome. And you all come out to Palm Springs and you hang out. And the interesting thing is that they make command invitations to politicians. The billionaires get to hang out. The politicians are told, you better come here and appear. And you're really tough, strong politicians like Chris Christie suddenly go very weak in the knees when asked to do something by the Koch brothers. Now in 2012, they were quite enthusiastic about young Paul Ryan. And Paul Ryan, actually, you mentioned Friedrich Hayek, right? Paul Ryan loves Austrian economics.
There's only...
Why? I have no idea, you know, but he's really into Austrian economics because he's apparently very right-wing. I had a higher view of Austria up until that point, but, you know, he apparently moved to Austrian economics having exhausted the Ayn Rand shelf in the library. And so they put him on, you know, he gets on the ticket with a lot of enthusiastic backing. Not a conspiracy to put him on the ticket, but all the rich guys really liked Paul Ryan. He was horrible. He was actually a lousy candidate. His own neighborhood in Janesville, Wisconsin, voted against him. He lost his precinct. He lost his city. He lost his county. He lost his state. And Mitt Romney lost the presidency. So one of the best things about the Koch brothers is they're not very good judges of people. They actually, you know, they blow it politically. But the biggest thing to understand about this is that when they gather in Palm Springs, now there's hundreds, even thousands of people outside protesting when they hold these events. 5 years ago, nobody knew who they were and nobody knew that they had an event. Now they're hiring helicopters to fly over and observe the crowds. So there is a national protest movement that has targeted energy on these guys. That's a very, very big deal. It has made the term ALEC an applause line in, you know, Unitarian churches across the country. Not an applause popular line, but and here's the happy story. The happy story is that when we were doing the ALEC project, there was this crazy legislator up in New Hampshire named Marcia Moody. And as soon as the project came out, Marcia Moody wrote a big piece where she read through everything and she said, I think this is Alec's influence on New Hampshire here in a right-to-work law. I think here's another example of, and she was, you know, accused of being a conspiracy theorist, being, you know, some kind of nut. Well, Marcia Moody kept banging on it, drawing out more and more evidence, kept writing for her local papers, kept talking to other people, kept talking to other legislators. And in November of this last year, of 2012, the Republican-controlled state House and state Senate in New Hampshire flipped to Democratic control. And Marcia Moody came marching in with majority status in those chambers, and they put a person on every committee to look through the legislation that was passed in the last few years for evidence that it had been tied to ALEC bills, and they have begun a meticulous process of reversing ALEC bills and undoing the damage.
Yeah.
And it's also the case that through the collective effort of a number of organizations, including Color of Change, and some of the pension funds that many unions are invested in, there's been a tremendous pressure on corporations to get out of ALEC. When we launched the ALEC Exposed website at CMD, we launched it with a postcard that said, what is Coca-Cola doing with Koch Industries? Privatizing Social Security, making it harder for college students to vote, pushing, working on climate denial, including there was an ALEC conference in which the topic of the workshop was warming up to climate change, how increased CO2 is good for you. This is the type of...
You guys really have to pause and take that in.
Yes, warming up to climate change.
This was a pro-climate change session.
Yes.
You didn't know that there were enthusiasts for this.
So we launched making sure people could understand who the corporations were in ALEC, who all the politicians were in ALEC, what the bill said, what the impact was on real people, and we said that Coca-Cola, should be ashamed to be part of this organization that's pushing these extreme ideas. And after the terrible tragedy in Florida and the increased focus and spotlight on ALEC, the first corporation to publicly announce that it was leaving ALEC was Coca-Cola. And since that time, 42 corporations have left ALEC, 42 major national corporations, including General Motors, General Electric, Bank of America, and others. And so, having Walmart leave ALEC, having a nuclear sort of waste company leave ALEC, man, if Walmart and a nuclear waste company don't want to be your friend, you've got problems. And so the national effort to expose these corporations, expose the ALEC agenda writ large, has led to these 42 corporations getting out, and I hear that there are a few more in the wings that we'll be announcing soon. About 6 nonprofits have gotten out of ALEC, including the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates' foundation has said it won't renew its grant. 71 state legislators have left ALEC, and another over 100 legislators either lost their seat in the primary or the general election or otherwise left office in this past election cycle, and so they've lost members in that sense. And then at the same time, their agenda continues, because the 2 most powerful men in the United States House of Representatives, John Boehner and Eric Cantor, they're ALEC alums. So these indications of the power of people speaking out is powerful, but there's a lot of work to be done, and that's why we have postcards in the back. It's about State Farm being a member of ALEC, and it says, good neighbors. You know, they have these ads, State Farm is there. I want to say State Farm is where? They're hanging out with the Koch brothers at ALEC, and so if you get a chance, please do fill out the postcard and send it in.
All right, my last question, and I don't know who wants to answer this, but you know, one of the things you've described as a scenario, our theater across town has the Koch brothers name ahead of it. So my question, the dinosaur section of the Natural History Museum. So my question is, on April 1st, on other days when we don't want to do Koch, does that mean we don't go to the theater, we don't go to the National Natural History Museum, we don't go for our chemo or radiation? I mean, what does it mean to really boycott the Koch brothers? And what about this cultural aspect?
It's a great question, and other people may have other things to say, but what I'll say is, you know, if a rich person wants to give me something, I'll take it. That's cool. I'm going to go look at the dinosaurs. I don't mind that. And I don't frankly mind. I think it's silly, frankly. I think it's silly to object to the fact that if they want to cure cancer. That's great. The problem that I've got, and by the way, the Koch brothers, I mean, no trouble on ego there, right? When you talk to David Koch, right, he will say, yeah, I plan to cure cancer in my lifetime. Well, that's great, and I want him to do that.
But not if the cure implicates any of his chemicals.
No, well, I understand that. But here's what I will say to you. This is the important thing. The challenge with the Koch brothers is that they want to be the people who decide what is done. And the way that they become the people who decide what is done, whether you put dinosaurs in the museum or you do this type of cancer treatment or whatever you do, is by dialing down the power of democracy. That's the critical thing, and that's why I focus on these voting issues. They want a society where rich guys like them can decide where the money goes and what happens with it. And as we target our activities, I think it's very, very important to target the places where they are trying to undermine democracy, where they, in my view, are trying to make it much harder for us to exercise our will. And so what I would suggest to you is that one of the best places before April 1st, right, is on March 24th, because this ties to ALEC. On March 24th, there's a National Day of Action to defend the post office and the United States Postal Service, because Federal Express and other groupings have been using their lobbying power to try and undermine the post office and end 6-day delivery service. So let's go out and start by defending something in the public sector. Boycotts are great, but I want to fight to keep what we've got. Secondly, if we could do one thing, right, and it's an affirmative thing. I don't mind boycotts. I'm all for boycotts, especially well-targeted ones. But I'd like to do an affirmative thing on April 1. Go find somebody who's not registered to vote. Find a citizen and get that person registered to vote. Get them on the rolls, and then make a commitment to them that when the next election comes, you will get them to the polls. You will make sure they're there. Because if you want to look at the most nefarious thing, aside from the stand your ground laws, which I think rise to a level that I can't even talk about, the most nefarious thing is these guys have been so central to and so supportive of these voter ID laws and these efforts simply across this country to make it harder to vote. So that's my bottom line. If I want to talk about a pushback on any day, first off, defend that which is public. Defend that which is public. And secondly, focus your energy on those affirmative acts that make sure that no matter how much money they put into the process, no matter how they try to rig it, that we've got enough voters to go out and exercise their democratic, small d democratic right to create and defend a public sphere where it's not a couple of billionaires deciding what we do, but it's all of us.
Lisa.
And I would say that I know that you have materials in the back that the Coffee Party has about which products are Coke products and which ones aren't, so that people can make some decisions about how they want to spend their money. And I'm all in favor of people making decisions about how they're spending the money and where that money is going to. And at the same time, I agree definitely with John about the importance of our public space and our public institutions like the post office. It's quite clear, and both FedEx and UPS are longtime members of ALEC, and they haven't gotten out. There are bills in ALEC that would say that they want to make it easier. The one area in which they want to make it easier to vote, in essence, is military voters, because I think there's some notion that they might vote a particular way, although they don't obviously all vote one way or the other. But what ALEC does, for example, is say that military ballots can't be carried by the post office. They have to be carried by FedEx or UPS by a more expensive service.
Can we just
Your vote can
pause for a second. Remember we paused on the global warming thing because that was pretty astounding. You understand this? They are passing laws at the state level to take business away from the post office, which is supposedly broke, and which does a better job of getting those ballots delivered.
So your vote, if you mail in, can go through the post office, but they want to give up basically contracts to UPS and FedEx to deliver those military votes. And this actually speaks to a much larger part of the ALEC agenda, which is what we're seeing underway across the board, which is this effort to privatize public goods, public services, privatize public schools, privatize Social Security, privatize our prisons, privatize anything that isn't nailed down. Including this effort to basically suggest that we shouldn't own buildings. At one of the ALEC conventions, there was a conversation about the public shouldn't really own these buildings. They should sell off these assets. We've got this great opportunity, someone said, in this economic crisis to get a hold of these institutions, and then we, the people, can be the tenants of our basically government buildings. And so what you see in ALEC over and over again as a rationale of so-called reform or claimed economic benefit, and what these practices do across the board in almost every one of these ALEC task forces is find a way to take your tax dollars, complain about the public schools, complain how much teachers are made, and then redirect those tax dollars to for-profit enterprises like virtual schools like K-12, which is on the ALEC Education Task Force, making, millions and millions and millions of dollars of revenue, hundreds of millions in revenue. Their CEO is paid like $500,000 a year plus stock options, has $25 million in stock options. 95% of their revenue comes from tax dollars that are taken out of public schools, and they say teachers are paid too much. This is the ALEC agenda.
All right, your turn. Questions from the audience. You need to line up right there at that microphone, and while you're doing that, I think Chuck's got some announcements for you all. Quick round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so far.
Okay. Hello, I'm Chuck Slatkin from the Big Apple Coffee Party and the Don't Do Coke campaign. While you were lining up to ask questions of our fabulous panel, I wanted to take a moment to talk about what we can do to stand up to the Koch brothers. It's not like we can vote them out of office. For this reason, the Big Apple Coffee Party developed the Don't Do Coke campaign locally. We created a Don't Do Coke flyer, which we hand out in front of supermarkets, telling people about what the Koch brothers have been doing and suggesting that they buy alternatives to Koch brothers products when they shop. We included one with your program. And at first, it really started as an educational campaign. People didn't know who the Koch brothers were, and they were finding out about them. But something happened during the last election campaign. seemingly almost overnight, all of a sudden people knew who the Koch brothers were, and they wanted to do something about it. They knew what they were doing with their money, and they wanted to see what they could do to change what was going on. People love these flyers. They grab them, they take them, and they use them. And they're buying alternative products to the Koch brothers' Georgia Pacific brand. It's an easy thing to do to not do something. Basically, you're not buying their products. You can choose something else. And I'll tell you, the Vanity Fair napkins is a really good product. It really hurt to stop using them. We will do that for the cause. Now, on April 1st this year, 2013, we're expanding our Don't Do Coke campaign into April Fool the Koch brothers, Don't Do Coke on April 1st. Now we're asking people everywhere to join us on April Fool's Day to distribute Don't Do Coke flyers in front of a local supermarket for 1 hour at 12 o'clock or 6 p.m. If this sounds good to you, you can sign up for a location in the New York City area, and you can also spread the word to people you know everywhere to join in. At worst, we'll be able to vent about the Koch brothers, and you'll feel better about that. And at best, we'll create a movement that will hit the Koch brothers where they hurt the most, in their wallets. Let's April Fool the Koch brothers on April 1st by spreading the word to Don't Do Coke. And you can find our Koch brother April 1st flyer in the back. That's the big one that talks about it. And we'll supply you with these flyers to give out if you're interested. So look for someone from the Big Apple Coffee Party and sign up to get active here. And I'll just take one more moment to say, when you work on these things, well, you know, we're human beings and their egos and whatever. We have these fabulous people who've come out here to speak to us tonight. And I'd just like to say from the people in the Big Apple Coffee Party, working with the Peace and Justice Task Force, from All Souls. It's been a fabulous experience, and we hope that we'll be working with them for years to come. So please keep the questions brief, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. All right, we have a good number of questions. I'm going to take 3 lots of 3, and then let our panelists respond as they will. So the first 3 questions, one after the other. All right, so let's take those 3 to begin. The question about, are there criminal charges that can be brought against these people? Can we have a little bit more on their role in the effort to sort of deny global warming and muddy the science there? And thirdly, what about well, 2 things interesting, the role of the Koch brothers funding in the New York governor's race and tax law proposals, and this idea of just because you give the last 100,000, how come you get to put your name on a building where the public's put in hundreds of thousands?
Let me start and try and take a couple elements of this. And there are people on the panel, I think especially Lee, and perhaps Lisa as well, who know a lot more on the global warming issue. Michael, I don't want to answer your question directly as regards to Kochs, because I don't know particular legal violations or specific prosecutions, and they may well have never, directly broken a law. And I'm not here to accuse them of that. What I will suggest to you, and this is an important thing about this session, we happen to be talking a lot about the Koch brothers. It's really interesting, and they have put themselves out there. There are dozens of other incredibly wealthy people who are much quieter, much more circumspect, but who are funding school privatization, all the Walmart family folks, who are funding all sorts of right-wing things, global warming stuff and that. And here's where I would suggest that the real challenge is for our society. We have created a circumstance where wealthy people in this country have incredible leeway within our politics, within even accountability issues, whether you're held to account when you do wrong, and as regards what they can buy, how they can throw a little money in at the right time and put their name across anything. And I think that the great challenge that we have as a society right now is to begin an accountability moment. Because they're coming as we speak. The project that the ALEC Exposed people have been working on in the last month or so, last couple months, has been an expose of the Fix the Debt campaign, which is Simpson and Bowles and Pete Peterson going out and saying we've got to balance our budget by lowering taxes for rich people and taking away Social Security cost of living increases. And so this is the kind of stuff I think we have to start to expose, that we have a process in our society where wealthy people get to ask for what they want and the rest of us don't. And where would I begin? Where would I begin? It's not with the Koch brothers, although they're related to this. I will not be satisfied until we begin to prosecute the guilty men who were responsible for the meltdown of the global economy because they created bubbles, they busted the banks, and then they took hundreds of billions of US tax dollars and put it into bank accounts which they sit on to this day. And when Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1933, he said, "We have chased the moneylenders from the temples, but we are not done with them. We are going to track them down and prosecute them for their crimes. If you are wealthy, you must be held to account when you break the law." We didn't do that in the aftermath of the Wall Street meltdown, and it's one of the reasons now that they're coming for our Social Security and our Medicare and our Medicaid. So that's a roundabout answer to your question, but I think if we start to do that, even the Koch brothers would begin to get a little more circumspect in what they do. I do. Yeah, I think.
Lisa.
And I'm going to leave the climate question to Lee, but I would say a couple of things on the accountability front that I think are important to note. And also thank John for the shout out to our Fix the Debt expose. If you want to find out more about it, it's at petersonpyramid.org, petersonpyramid.org, or you can look it up at our main site. The information's on this postcard. But the fact is that there have been efforts to hold the Koch brothers accountable over time. There was a congressional investigation in 1997 about Koch brothers' involvement in sort of election shell game groups, and there was a sort of an effort to try to uncloak what was called this triad operation that they were involved in. But Fred Thompson was then in the Senate. He was a Republican. He basically shut down the effort to subpoena to find out more. And so when I discovered this in part of my investigative work, we started the day after the election with a petition on our site, our PR Watch site, a petition to subpoena the Kochs. We want Congress, we want the Senate to subpoena the Kochs. We want them to come before the United States Senate and testify about what they're doing in our electoral politics, what they're spending the money on, what America's Prosperity is doing, how this relates to some of the things that we saw in the campaign. So, for example, in Wisconsin, the Koch brothers' operation, Americans for Prosperity, spent $10 million in the lead up to the recall. The Wisconsin effort to recall Scott Walker. They did a bus campaign. They put hangers on doorknobs that had Scott Walker's face. They were pushing for him to be saved. They claimed that all of it was coming out of the 501c3 nonprofit charity, tax-deductible charity. They said it wasn't political activity. I think that should be investigated.
Can I just emphasize, because again, Lisa says such smart things, and then sometimes you miss it. They get to deduct that from their taxes.
So we've been urging Congress to investigate it. We've asked the Senate Judiciary Committee to hold a hearing to investigate not just the Kochs, but a whole array of activities, including the activities by the guy, the multi-millionaire, perhaps billionaire, who leads Cancer Centers of America, and the operations that there's a IRS complaint about. So we've asked for a congressional investigation. We hope you'll join us in asking for that, because that's not a criminal investigation. It's a congressional investigation about whether our campaign finance laws are working, how money is being passed around, how it's being hidden. And I think that they should be asked under oath about that, or their representatives ought to be. And so that's what I think. But beyond that, there have been efforts to hold the Kochs accountable for other things. There was a 100-count indictment at the end of the Clinton administration for environmental violations by the Kochs. It was they were poised to face the largest fine in U.S. history for their environmental violations in terms of spills and other environmental consequences of the way they were running their business. And George Bush became president, and one of the very first things that happened was that John Ashcroft settled that case down to one count and wiped it all away. And so, you know, there are investigations that were pursued in the past, and that was a criminal investigation against a corporation and corporate activity under the federal law, and those were pursued. And so, I'm not suggesting that they have done anything in particular today or yesterday that warrants an indictment. What I am saying is that it's quite clear from where I sit, that there's a lot of money sloshing around in these charitable organizations that appears to be spent in a lot of ways where, at least on the radio, they say they're not spending it on electoral activity. We'll see what they do in their filings. And I think Congress has the purview, the power, to investigate how our campaign finance laws are working or not working. They're broken, and they ought to get to the bottom of it regardless of any criminal activity. As John said, I'm not suggesting that they are engaged in criminal activity. I think the laws are incredibly weak. And since Bush became president 12 years ago, the Supreme Court changed, and all of a sudden more money than ever is sloshing around in our election. And the Kochs are more than happy for that increased currency of money in our election.
Well, it's easier not to break the law if you're influential in making the law. Yeah, it's a good trick. Lee.
I just want to address all those questions really quickly. And we just have to be very careful. I don't think we ever want to, or folks should never seek to stoop to a level where you want to criminalize free speech or advocacy. We don't want to do that because that's authoritarianism. What animates me about the Koch brothers, it makes me interested to blog and write about it, is because they are suppressing freedom in so many ways. They're diminishing voting rights. They're ruining the public commons, so the air we breathe, the environment we live in. Just recently, they helped turn the Arkansas legislature, and they've now, all these Koch-funded candidates that are now lawmakers are restricting abortion access and reproductive health in the most extreme way we've seen it anywhere in the country, actually just last week in Arkansas. So I just want to make that clear. We don't, there are serious questions about their business that need to be looked at, but we never want to act authoritarian by criminalizing their ability to speak their mind. And then the other comment about global warming is an important one. In the early 90s, there's that fight about acid rain, right? And the late 80s, I should say. Koch Industries, their plants emitted a lot of they contributed to acid rain, and what Americans for Prosperity's precursor, Citizens for a Sound Economy, as Lisa was saying, they put out all of these ads and pamphlets that said acid rain, hoax or headline. And they tried to convince people, instead of arguing on the merits of what's the best way to address acid rain, they tried to undermine the science. And we've seen this repeated over and over and over again, and especially with respect to global warming. As I mentioned, they're a big emitter, but their tactics and how they fight this battle are dirty. Just last year, one Koch-funded group, the Heartland Institute, put out a billboard that compared belief in global warming to supporters of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. They fund a lot of groups that do kind of a harassment campaign on climate scientists, calling them liars and all kinds of other names in the book. And of course, there's the money to politicians who are denying the science. They even have, you've heard, I'm sure, of the Grover Norquist tax pledge, promising not to raise taxes a penny, essentially. Well, Americans for Prosperity has their own climate pledge, and they've gotten hundreds of politicians to sign it. And that's really made an effect, because now if you're a Republican and you're looking for a sensible way, maybe a market solution or a carbon tax, what have you, to deal with these issues, you can if you sign this pledge. And if you go back on the pledge, Koch has shown that they'll go into the Republican primary and take you out. And on the last point about funding Democrats like Governor Cuomo, that's incredibly important, because a lot of folks in the media talk about Koch as just a Republican a donor, but that's not the case. They give, I don't know, I'm going to just throw out a random percentage, but probably in the last couple of years, more than 95% of their money has gone to Republicans. You can fact check me later, but it's a very high percentage. But if you go back through the years, look at the kind of the group like the DLC. Back in the day, that was a group formed to move the Democratic Party to the right, to embrace some of these so-called market solutions and go away from traditional democratic and progressive values. Well, who was one of the lobbyists that helped set up that group was actually a Koch lobbyist. During the fight over, again, addressing climate change in 2009, 2010, Koch lobbyists gave significant amounts to Democrats who became, maybe it was a coincidence, I think not, very shaky about supporting efforts to address global warming. One of them, Senator Blanche Lincoln, again from Arkansas, took Koch money and, again, helped block the bill to address this problem. So hopefully that addresses some of those questions.
And I would just say, of course, I certainly was not suggesting that advocacy be criminalized. What I'm suggesting is that, we were very concerned to see the statements in the press about what American Prosperity was doing in Wisconsin, and what we think that nonprofit 501c3s can do under the tax law or not. But American Prosperity has two arms. It has a C4 and a C3, and we'll see how they do their accounting among those organizations. And so regardless, they've got very good lawyers. I'm sure they figured out a way to ensure that they're in full compliance with the law. My position is that regardless of whether they comply or not with the law, and they have said that they have, Congress has the power to investigate whether something is criminal or civil to determine whether our laws are functioning properly. And I would submit to you our laws in campaign finance are not. They're broken.
And there is an
That's
investigation.
I think we want to take three more questions, and then we'll come back to you. We've got the three questions, one about fair elections law, one about the Libertarian Democrat Alliance, and one about donor
New York's
transparency.
reform effort. Great questions all, and it's amazing that you all came to the same general turf, which is the fact that we seem to have a lot of money in our politics. One of the most important things that I'll say up front is that, as Michael asked us, how do we hold these people to account? And we talked about a lot of stuff that's very, very important. One of the best ways to hold them account is a money in politics issue, and it's one that libertarians and lefties of all kinds should be very comfortable uniting on. Michael Copps, the former Federal Communications Commissioner, has been pointing out in recent months that the Federal Communications Commission has already, right now, on the books, the power to require that television advertisers expose where their money came from. So you can't create a group, Citizens for Better Tomorrow with a lot of pie, right? And, you got to say Citizens for a Better Tomorrow with a lot of pie, paid for by Charles and David Koch. Right? You have to name who did this. The FCC has the power to do this right now. They've just got a report this last week that analyzed it and said, absolutely, no question. And yet they're not doing it. And this is an important thing to understand, because this is an indictment of the Obama administration, President Obama, and his appointees. And yesterday I was with Russ Feingold, and Russ Feingold said that, and I quote him directly, that the Federal Election Commission today is a joke, that it doesn't even enforce the existing laws. So we have a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate at this point, and yet we are not enforcing basic laws that would allow us to get a lot of information there. So one of the first things that I would do as New Yorkers, because it happens New Yorkers send a lot of Democrats to Congress, not many Republicans. This is a place where you can be in the center of the fight. Talk to Jerry Nadler, who is, to my mind, one of the best members of Congress and is on judiciary and does a very good job. Tell him you want him to really make some noise about this. Talk to Jose Serrano from the South Bronx. Talk to other members from New York. Let's get a New York delegation making noise in Washington, D.C. about enforcing the existing regulations as a way to hold these people to account. That's something you can do right now, and I think it would be a great idea. Secondly, just to go quickly on the one other thing, on the fair elections bill that you've got here in New York State. The bill is a very good bill. It's better than most of what we're seeing around the country. I think it's a great thing to do, and I strongly encourage aggressive support for it. But I'm going to tell you something. You're going to support it as part of an experiment, not as part of necessarily the end of problems. Because that bill wouldn't stop the Koch brothers from coming in under Citizens United and spending the money that way that they want to do it. That's the unfortunate reality. The only way that you can stop it is if that bill includes, and this is the thing they're going to fight about, if that includes resources to equal the spending by the outside interests against a candidate. So you become a fair elections candidate, then if somebody comes in with quote unquote independent expenditure against you, will the state give you resources to balance that off? Now that's how it actually operates in some places. If you've got that, that's a real counter to them. If you don't, you lock somebody into a fair elections plan, but they can still have the heck beaten out of them. Yes?
Yeah, but the Supreme Court ruled down the Arizona.
I know. That's what, well, you see.
It's not a panacea. We need
No, but dear, I'm gonna agree with you.
mitigate
Yeah.
Well, let me just say, do
He's
it
with
for
you.
another reason. Do it. Put it on the books here. And you need to do it. It's a good idea. Make the U.S. Supreme Court strike your law down. And then turn around to people and say, okay, we tried to fix the thing. The courts won't let us. It is time to pass a constitutional amendment that says corporate money cannot dominate our politics. I understand your point. This is the big deal. We need to combine our reform efforts.
All right,
Absolutely, dear.
Keep going.
I'm with you 100%. But what I'm telling no, it doesn't. It does not take years to pass a constitutional amendment. You can pass a constitutional amendment in a week. The fact of the matter is that you must create the will to pass a constitutional amendment, and then it happens fast. The bottom line is this. I think New York is central to the efforts to pass a constitutional amendment, because we need to show power, including the Democratic Party. We need to show power in this country that we're trying. We are making every effort to repair our politics, and if the courts won't let us, then expose that so that the people are ready to cry out for a constitutional amendment. We must, I'm going to say at the end of the day, we must amend our Constitution to get corporate money out of our politics.
So I was just going to tell you a couple quick things in response. One is we actually just published an expose today on our PR Watch site about this thing called the Goldwater Institute in Arizona. The Goldwater Institute is a Koch-funded think tank in the state that was the litigator that went up to the Supreme Court to strike down the matching fund, basically the rule that said in Arizona, if you had publicly financed elections and your opponent was getting outside money or was expending this outside expenditure, you could have public funds to match that, to level the playing field. That group won that case before the Bush Supreme Court, basically, in 2011. And what we exposed today was how, after getting $1 million in attorney's fees for that litigation up to the Supreme Court, they turned around and gave their litigator, this is a nonprofit, gave their litigator a $50,000 bonus on top of their salary, and then turned around and gave a sweetheart deal of a loan to one of their board members. So if you want to find out more about that, we've got it on our site. But it goes to this question of, this is a group that's Koch-funded and funded by some of these other big interests. They're litigating to strike down our clean elections laws. And what New York is doing is very important, as John said. It is part of a long-term battle to retake our democracy. And my organization, the Center for Media Democracy, has been involved in that fight to support amending the Constitution to deal with these problems. And we've also been working on other measures to basically recalibrate the U.S. tax law so that a nonprofit, a 501c4 organization like one part of David Koch's operation, or like some of the Karl Rove related groups, can't spend 49% of their money on activities that basically help in these electoral campaigns without disclosing their donors. Because the question of donor disclosure is one that we know there's sensitivity about. Traditionally, a nonprofit, a 501c3 organization existing for charitable purpose does not have to disclose its donors. There's a Supreme Court case going back 50 years in the NAACP case, because the right-wing citizens groups, the CCCs down there in the states, wanted to know who were NAACP members when they wanted to crush the NAACP. And so they were trying to get that membership information. And that's why the Supreme Court said you can't get the membership organization from like an association like that, because you would be revealing their donors who are associating with one another. But what you have in something like some of these other groups that are playing politics in the elections, like Karl Rove's Crossroads GPS, you have a way that they're cloaking donors who are intending to influence the elections. In fact, we saw in the campaign last year that one group in Montana actually had a PowerPoint presentation telling donors, if you give to our C3 organization or C4, your identity will be secret, and you can sit back on election day and watch the results roll in.
Where did they find the PowerPoint presentation?
In a crack house.
Can't make it up. I know.
So
you
there
can't
was
make
just
it up.
paper that
the
had...
guy who had it went to a crack. Apparently, we don't know this for sure, but somebody went to a crack house and had a very good time and forgot the booklet.
Very good. That's what we like.
There are these rules about the privacy of a genuine charitable organization keeping its membership private. But if a group is going to engage in the electoral politics and basically act like a PAC or act as if they are a PAC trying to influence the results, we think that information should be disclosed. We've advocated for changing the regulations within the IRS to get those donors disclosed. If you're going to play that kind of role, then you ought to follow the FEC rules and reveal the dollars coming in, dollars coming out, and that's what we're pushing for.
All right, last 3 questions.
I'll start, and then smarter people will say things. First off, the gentleman actually asked a really significant question, which is there a counter to ALEC? Can we do it on the good guy side, the good gal side? We don't want to have our own ALEC. We don't want that because it's a secretive group that does things behind closed doors and gives power to those who have money. We want to create an alternative that really does reflect our values and who we are. And there is a group called Alice. ALEC in Wonderland, Alice in Wonderland. And Alice was started by Joel Rogers, one of the great, and a number of other people, one of the great thinkers as regards social policy in this country. And it is an alliance of legislators who are actually on the side of environmentalism and clean government and good stuff. They don't have as much money as ALEC, but they're starting to build out and do some really good stuff. And so you could go online, just look for Alice and legislator, and you're going to find some people that are starting to work on this. Get your legislator to be a part of it. Secondly, and I'll let other people take it, on the arts, yes. The answer on the arts is a simpler question than that. If we just funded the arts in the way that every other civilized country in the world did, wealthy donors wouldn't mean as much. And so the answer to your question is not to, I think the challenging, raising it, but also we need to fight for arts funding in this country, and it's something we don't do enough. And finally, this coalescing issue. How do we bring it all together? The woman who stood up here, I forget, I don't know your name. What? She's from the League of Women Voters. And I just want to cite her. She got up here and raised an issue, the New York fair elections fight. Says, here's something, can we get involved in this? Often when we get in these big things, we hear a lot of stuff thrown out. It's all important. But at the end of the day, it's all a cacophony. I will say to you right today, you want to coalesce around something? You have a fight in your home turf that's going to play out over the next couple months. It's a doable fight that most of your officials say they are for. Why not pick that fight and go nuts on it? Let's see if we can win it here in New York. But the reason I cite you and the reason I pick you out for that reason is because then, is it Thera? Tell me your name one more time. Theron. Did I get it right? Okay, thank you. Then I just told you to go follow Theron and work with her and the League of Women Voters to pass this thing. Once you've passed it and once you've won it, I want Theron to say, look around, have a meeting, and be at a meeting and point to somebody else and say, let's all get together behind that cause. That's the way that we do it. We hand our causes off to one another, but we all go together to it. Our biggest problem is we think there's one solution to a problem. There isn't anymore. There's no one solution to any problem in this country. We've got to take everybody who cares about it all and come together. And the lesson on this comes from 100 years ago. The greatest period of reform in American history was from 1910 to 1920. In a 10-year period, we took an appointed U.S. Senate and made it an elected U.S. Senate. We gave the power to the people. The next year, we imposed an income tax on this country, and we started to actually tax rich people and make them pay their fair share. And then when we got done doing that, after a period of all sorts of legislatures passing women's rights laws, workers' rights laws, children's laws, we finished off the decade by giving women the right to vote. Now, you tie together an elected Senate, an income tax, and women having the right to vote. It may be a little hard. You throw in some child labor, some workers' rights, it starts to get complicated. Except, you know what? If you called yourself a progressive in 1910, you were for an elected Senate, you were for an income tax, and you were for giving women the right to vote and all those other reforms. That's what we have to be. We have to take on one thing at a time, unite for it, and then go and take on the next thing. It's going to take us 10 or 20 years, but the bottom line is if we unite, we are so much more powerful than they are. We need a new age of reform, and we need to all be a part of it.
I actually will just quickly respond to a question I thought was a really good one from a gentleman about why libertarians don't work with progressives, or why they should work with progressives to reform some of these campaign finance issues that are really across the board and allow actors like the Kochs to abuse the system, gain crony capitalism, what have you. I mean, one of the problems with the Koch brothers, I guess, is that they've polarized so many issues to the point where you can't sit down and discuss them in rational ways. I mean, there are certainly government-based solutions and there's market-based solutions, and as long as folks acknowledge certain problems, they can probably find the best way to address them. But like global warming, they've made it into an issue that's kind of red team, blue team, and you can't get to the point where what is the best way to curb carbon emissions? What would be the best solution to do it in a way where you can maximize job growth from it, make sure that when people are moving away from carbon-based fuels, there aren't too many negative setbacks. And it's a complicated question, but when you polarize things by accusing folks of, being in league with Ted Kaczynski, and it's difficult to have that rational conversation. And campaign finance is a really good one, because you look at the deals made in Congress at these massive bailouts, these corporate giveaways. Look at the tax code. It's littered with ridiculous tax expenditures that allow ultra-profitable corporations to pay a negative tax rate, essentially, getting tax credits back. So again, campaign finance has become one of those issues because the Koch brothers happen to fund just so many conservative groups. I have friends and acquaintances who consider themselves conservative, but like global warming, they can't talk about these issues like campaign finance in a rational way for the very practical reason, if they get active on this issue, it's going to be hard for them to find a job in the conservative movement. They will be ostracized or blacklisted, not officially, but in practice, from getting jobs on campaigns or at think tanks or at institutes. It's that simple. So it's not ending this on a positive note, but just as the Koch brothers have moved the Republican Party to the right and polarized the Republican Party, they've also just moved the conservative movement in such a way that it's really tough to address these issues, and I think that's kind of the greatest tragedy.
So I ponder this question a lot because I'll be at meetings and someone will say, we just need a right-left coalition on this. If only we could get these elusive Tea Party people to join in, we would win this issue. And I'm sort of torn about it in part because what I saw happen in 2009 in the aftermath of the meltdown in Wall Street was that there was a huge populist moment in which people from all walks of life could have come together to demand that those bankers be held accountable, to demand that this be addressed, and some people perhaps thought it was going to happen with that presidential election, that with the end of Bush-Cheney that certain things would change, and then next thing you knew, the Goldman Sachs guys rode into the Treasury Department and we sort of had this continuation of policy. But what actually happened behind the scenes in some ways was an effort by some of these right-wing groups and these right-wing operatives to basically turn the focus of these Tea Party Americans before they knew to call themselves Tea Party Americans and say, it's not Wall Street that's the problem. Don't focus on Wall Street. it's government that's broken. It's government that's wrong. And the reason why, in some ways, government is broken to that extent, or in that particular way, is because government is doing the bidding of Wall Street. And so they wanted to redirect that anger, that fear, that concern about the economy from Wall Street and focus it on government, which is part of what the Tea Party has done. But what's happened in that context is that through these various mechanisms that the Kochs and others, like the Bradley Foundation and other right-wing funders have fueled, is sort of the right-wing press at the grassroots level. So you have Fox News on TV, but at the grassroots level you have a lot of mechanisms like Freedom Works, which is spawn of Koch's Citizens for a Sound Economy. It's split into two. Freedom Works is one arm, Americans for Prosperity is another arm. They're run independently, but they're a spawn of David Koch's CSE, and they both fuel the Tea Party in different ways. And so cutting through that and getting to those Tea Party guys and getting them the truth is very difficult when they're watching, for the most part, watching Fox News all the time and getting bulletins from these institutions. I would say that this elusive right-left aspiration in some ways is the wrong thing to aim for. The fact is that most Americans, if they were listening and if they were thinking about what's happening in our country, moderate mainstream Americans along with progressives could be a substantial, powerful majority. You don't need to get the right wing to join you. You need to get progressives and moderates and people in the middle who know that something has gone awry, know we're getting screwed, for lack of a better term, and that we need to basically retake our democracy. And so I would say that the challenge really is, how can we talk about these issues in ways, how can we share the facts in ways that ordinary Americans understand what's going on and feel empowered to do something about it, feel like they have a stake in it, they have a vision for our future. And I say that in part having been in the trenches on the Patriot Act fight, where I went to a number of the so-called of the Wednesday group meetings, the infamous meetings that Grover Norquist has in Washington, D.C. I was the ACLU's rep at those meetings. They wouldn't let me take notes. I couldn't record. They basically, every time I came in for the meetings I was invited to, would remind me that I could not take any notes. Their staffer would. But what I saw there was something that was amazing, and it's worth understanding this lesson for this audience and for the bigger cause. It's precisely what John said, which is that in those meetings what you saw were a host of right-wing interests basically saying, me too, the right to life people, they would know that they weren't going to win a vote, and it wasn't their year, that issue wasn't going to be pushed that year. But they were behind the other issues, the effort on the courts. They were behind the other issues that the right was pushing because they knew they had institutional patience or strategic patience. They knew that they were part of the vision for the future. And so our question, the challenge, and I would say now speaking for myself as a progressive and not necessarily for my organization, the challenge is to have patience and a vision. Because I'll tell you what, the right wing, Koch brothers know where they want this country to be in 20 years. They have a vision for it. And at those meetings, at those Grover Norquist meetings and related meetings, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, the people in those meetings, some of them joked about killing public education. When I heard it, I was astonished, I was shocked. How could they think that this was even possible that they could do? But they have systematically put in place measures to piece by piece by piece take away public education and push it into the private hands. You see that in the right to choose, the abortion issue. It's piece by piece by piece, just tearing the tatters away. You see it in voting, piece by piece by piece, just a multiplicity of efforts to take these, to reduce these rights. They have patience because they have a vision for where they want to go. I actually had a meeting with some other, right-wing libertarians when we were debating Citizens United, and one of the libertarians, these beholden libertarians, said he doesn't believe in one person, one vote. The country had it right at the beginning. Property holders should vote, and in fact, if you have more property, you should have more say. That one person, one vote was an anathema to him as a libertarian associated with one of these groups. And I tell you this because it is shocking. Their vision for our country is so radical and so extreme, and systematically it's being moved. And so the question is, what is our vision? What do we want for arts funding? I don't want people's names on buildings. I want the public to support arts. I want those to be our buildings, not their buildings, not whether it's the Kochs or someone else. I want us to make sure that those CEOs that we've outed and fixed the debt, aren't sitting there on Capitol Hill and on MSNBC on one of the shows, or over there on CNBC or whatever, pretending like they've got a solution for debt while they're not paying taxes, while they've got a negative tax rate, while they are underfunding their pensions, and while they're behind the scenes, their corporations are lobbying to change the territorial tax system for international taxation to get out of paying taxes, their fair share. And so they have a vision. Our vision has to be, you know, we're in this together, we're Americans, we pay together, they pay their fair share, we pay our fair share. We want to have a system in which our people are taken care of, which people aren't homeless and on the streets because they're older and their pension plans have been decimated by these corporate raiders. We have to have a vision for what we want, and we have to have the institutional patience to fight for it. And this is the last point, which is the thing that they did was that they knew they were going to lose in these Grover Norquist meetings on some issues. They knew it, and they planned for that loss. They talked about how they're going to take that loss and use that loss as fuel for the victory to come. What happens on the left is that there's a loss, and people are like, oh, we can't change it, it'll never happen, we're screwed again, sorry. And you know, it's devastating. We lost this battle. But I'll tell you what, you don't win one battle or another battle. And when John says this is a structural issue, the Koch brothers are in a structural fight to restructure our government and our economy. We have to have the patience to say, we're going to lose battles, and we're going to use that loss as fuel to say, that's why we need more people. That's why we need more effort to win them, because we have a vision for our country that is positive versus this, you know, this crony capitalism sort of extremism in which in the vision, as I pointed out, of this sort of one of these ALEC operations, the vision is the private sector owns our cities, owns our public life, owns our public buildings, and we're basically tenants. If you want to be a tenant, in essence, in their private sector control of our democracy, then just, you know, give up. Or we can fight and talk and organize and win.
All right, are you fueled for the victory to come? Lisa Graves, Lee Fang, John Nichols, thanks very much.
Laura Flanders. Laura Flanders.